Welcome back to the Friendship Bread Podcast. I'm Alma, and I'm here with Krystal. We love to have real, honest, and raw conversations about life and everything that goes with it. And just like in any good friendship, nothing is off limits.
And this week, we thought we could talk about gravy. If you guys were listening last week, you know that we talked about mashed potatoes. The great mashed potato debate.
Yes, it was...
Wow.
It was intense.
That's 4 words I never thought I would say. The great mashed potato debate. Can we get a bumper sticker? I want one that says, I survived the mashed potato debate of 2021. But yeah, in all seriousness though, we talked about Thanksgiving and everything. Do you guys realize, Alma, Thanksgiving is in a week.
A week?
1 week.
Oh, it came up so quick.
Start baking.
Oh my goodness, Krystal.
What?
Thanksgiving is going to be interesting for me this year.
Yeah, because you can't have half of the things.
Yeah. I did a food allergy, food sensitivity test, and I can't eat eggs.
Or wheat.
Oh, and black pepper. It's very interesting.
Oh my gosh. You're going to live... Okay. Listen. After we talked about the mashed potatoes last week, and you said nothing had any spices, you now have to live without black pepper.
I love black pepper too. It's really sad.
You are going to live without spices now, Alma.
I've done it to myself.
That's what you get.
I've done it to myself, yeah. No, but, okay, that sounds really severe, but, like, the goal, the doctor I'm working with, the goal is to eventually be able to eat those things again. But
yes,
for now, my body is going through some health things, and during this time, I will be avoiding those foods, along with several others, including but not limited to blackberries and shrimp.
I would be really sad about the shrimp thing, honestly, if I was you.
I like shrimp too.
But, hey, we're just gonna, we're gonna hope it works, and that... yeah, you're going to be able to eat those things again.
Yeah. Thankfully, she did say, if you have one day, because I was like, excuse me, Thanksgiving is very soon. And then Christmas is after that. And she's like, you know what, Alma, if you have one day that you eat foods that you're not supposed to eat, it'll be okay. You might just feel crappy the next day. And I was like, fun, but good to know.
Yeah. So you can make an educated decision.
Yes. Anyways, I will be exploring for Thanksgiving how to make gluten-free desserts. So, doesn't that sound all hoogly and all?
Sure.
Thanks, Krystal. You're helping my motivation.
I don't know. Sometimes I got my things that I like. I like my mashed potatoes. I like my gravy.
Yeah.
I don't really know that I want to... I like exploring new foods sometimes, but not at Thanksgiving.
No, Thanksgiving is so full of classics.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it'll be okay. I'll survive. Hopefully by Thanksgiving of 2022, things will be back to the normal, and I will be back to eating gluten.
All the gluten?
All the gluten.
Just share, okay? Share some with other people. Perfect.
You can have a little bit of gluten. All right. Anyways, so talking about Thanksgiving got us thinking about the season and all the things that we think of when we think of Thanksgiving.
Little hint here, I guess, actually. November is actually Indigenous Peoples Month.
Ooh.
And I'm going to guess that probably a lot of you have gotten... How far into November are we now? Have you even heard that it's Indigenous Peoples Month?
I haven't.
Yeah. That's because it's not really talked about.
Yeah.
Nobody really says anything about it. And in comparison to some of the other things that we have months for, you really don't hear about it.
Yeah.
Compared to how much you hear about some of the other months that we have.
Yeah.
So we thought it would be fun to maybe talk a little bit about Indigenous Peoples Month.
I love this idea. And kind of background, Krystal loves history. and she loves studying up on it, and learning. Okay, I should say Krystal loves true history. She loves finding out, like, the truth behind some stories that maybe we aren't actually taught the whole truth of in school. And she has actually recommended a lot of really good books to me and helped me learn more about the Indigenous history in America. And so I'm going to kind of like take a back seat this episode and let her share a little bit about this. And no, she's not claiming to be an expert.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Yeah.
These are just things I've always been interested in history and the world just in general, but especially Indigenous history, since, well, I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in it, like a little girl. So I've just, tried to gather information here and there where I can and just inform myself a little more about it, because I've realized there's a lot of things that we are taught in school and in our history books that are not true, or more often it's one-sided.
Yes.
We have very one-sided history, which makes sense because you always hear history from the side of the victors when there's a war.
Yeah.
So
you're right.
So that makes sense there. But yeah, I'm definitely not an expert.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do my best to not misrepresent anything. So, yeah.
I, for one, am really excited because, number one, I like listening to you talk about it because you're passionate about it. But then number two, it is just very cool to hear, it's eye-opening to hear a different side to the history of America that I wasn't taught in school. Or I was taught very little. We discussed in probably 8th grade history class, a little bit about the Indigenous history, but it was like very quickly glossed over, and then we moved into, the next part.
Yeah. And if, talking about Indigenous history and, relation to Thanksgiving, it always makes me think of, what are, Thanksgiving crafts people do?
Usually involving turkeys.
Yes. And sometimes also they do what they call Indian headdresses.
Oh, yes.
And just so you guys know, it's actually, it's not cool because that's something that's really sacred to Indigenous people, are those things. And they had to earn every feather that's in their headdress. And so, to make light of something that's sacred to them.
Yeah.
So, Alma, where would you say American history starts?
I think what I was taught, I would used to have say when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Yeah. I think probably about 75%, if not more, history books start with a new world.
Yes.
But here's the thing. I think that a lot of people would say that Christopher Columbus discovered America, right?
Yeah, there's a whole day dedicated to him.
Exactly. But here's a couple of fun facts. 1, Christopher Columbus actually never set foot on America. 2, they called the natives Indians because they thought they were in India.
Ooh, I did know that one.
Because if you didn't know, or if you've forgotten, the whole point is that Christopher Columbus was trying to find a shorter trade route to get to India to get the spices. And they thought if they sailed our way, they could come around the other side of India and it would be shorter. That did not work for them.
Nope.
They found a lot of land instead. Where Christopher Columbus landed was actually islands in South America or Central America, somewhere in there. And so he saw these people and he took them as slaves. And they were not kind to them. They called them savages because they were different. If you know much about those cultures, a lot of those cultures, breasts weren't seen as anything sexual, so they didn't cover them. Mm-hmm. And because of that, the European men saw those women as no better than animals, basically. And a lot of women were assaulted because of that.
Wow.
Which is horrifying. So, but then Christopher Columbus went back to Spain, and he said, I discovered this new world. Now, I'm going to repeat something that a man called Mark Charles said, because I think it is so smart. If you think that Christopher Columbus discovered America, I would encourage you to please leave your car keys and your cell phones. Please leave them laying around. I will come and discover them for you.
Yes.
And that kind of, like, really puts it into perspective for us. Like, he didn't discover it. People were already there. Mm-hmm. It had already been discovered. It wasn't discovered. And that's something that we're told in our history, is that it was discovered.
Yeah.
It wasn't. It was already somebody else's land. So these ships of settlers came over, and at first, like, the natives were fine with sharing land. Like, at first, if you think about what does it say in history? Usually it says that at first the Indians, because they call them Indians, because we're not in India. They're not Indians. Mm-hmm. Indians live in India. Okay? Like, let's just be clear. Okay, thanks. They were indigenous. They were native people, whichever one works. They'll say, like, oh, the natives were friendly at first, and then suddenly they turned on us. No, they started defending their homes and their land when their land was being stolen.
Yeah.
And we were talking about Native history with our kids, because we homeschool. So during history, we're talking about some of the, a kid-friendly version of a little bit of what happened in those early days of the Europeans being in America. And he said, my 7-year-old, he said, so Mom, like, why were they all fighting? And I asked him, I was like, so if you had some people that moved into the neighborhood, and they were your neighbors, and you guys were friends, and everything was fine, would you fight them? And he was like, no. I was like, what if they came into your house and said, this is my house now, and you have to go live somewhere else? And he was like, I would fight them. Okay? Like, who wouldn't defend their home?
Yeah.
It's like a natural instinct. Mm-hmm. And so the European settlers really came in and, like, tried to take over everything, and then were shocked when these people stood up and said, no, this is our land, these are our homes, and you can't have them. Mm-hmm. And then they were portrayed as savages for that.
Yeah.
Also, here's another fun fact. Alma, what would you say is something that we are told that natives did to their enemies?
The first thing that pops in my head is scalping.
Yeah. So here's a fun fact. The scalping actually was first done by the Anglos and the Saxons. Over in, like, way back, the Anglos and the Saxons were, like, in the United Kingdom, like, early on.
Okay.
Okay? So that's where that originated.
Okay.
They actually taught that to, when the European settlers came over here, they taught that to the natives. There had been no history of natives scalping each other, ever.
Oh my goodness.
And that is something that is portrayed as natives did this because they were barbarians. But actually it's something they were taught. And then the settlers got mad when the natives turned it on them. Isn't that so interesting?
That is very interesting. It's really sad.
It is, because history gets skewed to the side of the victor. Mm-hmm. And, we talk about just some different perceptions we have about history even here. Like, people will be like, oh, the Romans, like, Rome was such a great empire. Like, they just, like, they went in and they conquered. And it's not like, oh my gosh, they conquered. It's like talked about as like it being a good and victorious thing, which is because Rome was the victor. So history is skewed to the side of Rome.
Yeah, that makes sense. That honestly makes me think of like my first, like when I was a kid and I would read like the Laura Ingalls books.
Yeah.
As much as I love the Laura Ingalls series, Little House on the Prairie and everything, the Native Americans were never discussed in a good light.
No. And if you think about it, like, of course they came to see what was going on when they built their house out there on the prairie, because you're building on their land.
Yeah.
And, like, also I can understand why the family was afraid, because they were acting on the information that they had, that they knew.
Yes.
And I think another thing that people forget is that by the time we're talking about settling the West, people had already pushed so many of the natives that had lived in the East to the West. Mm-hmm. So natives were having skirmishes with each other because, more natives are coming into land that's not theirs because they have nowhere else to go. So the tribes that were in the West were hearing all these stories of how the white men had pushed the tribes in the East out of their lands.
Yeah.
So by the time the white men come to the West, what are they seen as? They are seen as this great oppressor who is coming to steal their land, which, I mean, not wrong. But, some of them were peaceful and they wanted to, like, get along. But there was already this established history of this is what happens.
Yeah.
And that is why you hear so many more stories of things like massacres and scalpings and all of those things, or like them burning cabins, or like, finding wagon trains. Because at that point they realized that this was an invasion and that, like, it had to be stopped. Mm-hmm. And they were trying to fight back.
Yeah.
Which makes sense if you think about it from their viewpoint. Another thing that was, like, misrepresented is that when the settlers got sick, in some of the different colonies, it's talked about, like, in history books, it's talked about, like, oh, well, they got sick because they were in contact with some tribes. But what actually happened is they got sick because they weren't cleaning their water properly, or, like, taking some of those steps to keep their colony clean. Those things that they needed to do. Or, like, things from, like, traveling over, by sea for months, Those were the things that made them sick. They actually infected tribes.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, you have a bunch of settlers who have never lived in this environment before, as compared to the natives who lived there. They know better how to take care of themselves. They know better how to live in this environment than the new settlers do.
So something else that's not really talked about is, I know in Canada specifically, there was more than one instance where they purposefully, deliberately gave blankets that they knew were infected with smallpox to the tribes.
I remember learning about this.
Smallpox was something that they didn't have any natural immunity against it, because smallpox was not a disease that natives had. Mm-hmm. It was a European disease. And it wiped out like 75% of their population.
That's so sad.
And then there was another instance of, as things were getting really bad in the East, and I'm sorry that I can't remember like a specific timeline of things. I really should. There was also an instance where 50,000 natives, they committed mass suicide because they were afraid of being captured by the white settlers.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's just crazy. So things like that really affected the numbers of the natives. Mm-hmm. And that combined with weapons that they had never seen before, guns. Mm-hmm. They had lots of really great inventions. Like people talk about like, oh, we brought so many good things to natives. But I would argue really didn't. They had great inventions already, and they were actually living in a way that was taking better care of the earth and honoring nature and like recognizing the beauty in nature, only using what they had to. Those were principles that the native tribes lived by. Mm-hmm. And they considered it their duty to protect their lands. Yeah. It was their honor that had been bestowed on them. They took it so seriously.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people have this perception that natives were probably not intelligent because they weren't cultured according to what society said they should look like the European society. Mm-hmm. The reality was they just had different customs. They were cultured in different ways.
Yes.
And they had a different way of living. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think when we're confronted with a different way of living, other than like what we're used to, it makes us so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of probably what would happen with the European settlers is they were so uncomfortable by it.
Yeah. That makes sense to me, because even some of these truths, they're uncomfortable truths.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because, like, if you think about it, if you are a white person who is living in the United States, you came from somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Like, you came from a European country of some sort or another, somewhere down the line. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying all of our ancestors had a hand in massacring, natives. Like, no. I'm not, that's not at all what I'm saying, but it's just the reality of it. And that's an uncomfortable truth for us to think about.
Yeah.
That if you want to go by who originally owned the land, that none of us belong here.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, based on the very beginnings of settlings here, our current life could look so different. Mm-hmm. There could be a shared America.
Yeah.
Between the native people who were originally here and the people who wanted to live here as well. I think it's uncomfortable to think about that the native people were originally okay with sharing.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, just like with any group of people, that there were tribes that probably were like, I don't want them here at all, and were selfish maybe. Mm-hmm. But like as a whole, I don't think so. There were so many tribes.
Yeah.
So many.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that you say that, because I think like growing up, I thought that like Native Americans were like kind of sprinkled throughout the land, and there was small tribes, but as I like learned more, I realized like there were so many people living in this land. And
also there were like native people in, well, obviously like Mexico. Mm-hmm. Mexicans are native people. And in a lot of the other countries, there were like specific different dialects for different, islands. Like Polynesian people were native people. And that would have been like Hawaii and some other places like that. And there's like so many different ones. And they all looked so different. Like Inuits in Alaska. Mm-hmm. All native people, all indigenous people. People really we only see one subgroup because that's what we were taught to see. Mm-hmm. This is going to sound really terrible, but we were taught to see natives as this person who is running at us, screaming with a hatchet raised above their head and probably carrying a couple of scalps in the other.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the perception.
Mm-hmm.
But that really wasn't usually the truth. So, one thing I thought it would be cool to talk about since we're approaching Thanksgiving is the specific tribe that we're actually talking about when we talk about natives and Thanksgiving and how they helped the settlers.
Okay.
So they were called I'm going to say this right. Okay, I'm trying. So hopefully. They were called the Wampanoag.
Okay.
They lived on the island of Martha's Vineyard and in southern Massachusetts and eastern Rhode Island. A lot of people don't know the tribe by name, and a lot of people also think that tribe has been completely wiped out. But there are actually still people of that tribe.
Wow.
Like descendants from that. They would have been the ones who had their encounters with the English colonists who came on the Mayflower in 1620 for the whole, Plymouth
Rock?
Mm-hmm, exactly. So a lot of the colonists died of scurvy and, poor nutrition, not knowing how to build adequate shelters was an issue. They called winter the starving time. And as it turned to spring, I think we all have heard, of someone called Squanto.
Mm-hmm.
But his name was actually Tisquantum.
Okay.
So it wasn't actually Squanto. There's a lot of names and even for tribes. We call tribes by their English or French, usually sometimes, names, and not actually what they call themselves.
That's interesting.
So Tisquantum came to the colony and he actually spoke English and they all met. And Tisquantum told them that their leader wanted to hold peace talks with them, and that their leader believed that the English and their weapons could be helpful to the Wampanoag. In return, his people would help the colonists if they were attacked. So the colonists agreed, and talks were held, and that resulted in the Treaty of 1621.
Okay.
After that successful treaty, they decided that they had also, in the fall, the English actually had a successful harvest. And so they decided that together they were going to celebrate this treaty and the harvest and all of it together. They had a 3-day feast. Really, they never called it Thanksgiving, but there was just a letter that they wrote that they sent back to family that just was an account of the feast. So the 1621 treaty actually kept peace for 50 years.
Wow.
Which is another thing we don't know. Because in stories, it's often portrayed like they had Thanksgiving and then within a few weeks after that, it all turned to war.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not true either.
Yeah.
Peace was actually held for 50 years. But after their leader, after he died, everything kind of went downhill. More English had moved into the colony. They built up the towns. They had a lot of issue with their livestock straying onto native lands and eating their crops and all kinds of stuff like that. And then there was also this thing that was happening where the European settlers were using dishonest ways of acquiring lands from the natives. See, at first, they were buying the land from the natives. They didn't just come and say, oh, we're going to take it. It was like, I'm going to give you this and this and this and this in exchange for this land.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like they were buying and selling the land, and it was fine. So then when, more and more the natives started to refuse to sell land and the settlers were taking it dishonestly, then the settlers decided that the natives, the Wampanoag, should have to observe their laws and customs. And that they had to become Christians. and that they could no longer worship in the way that they wanted to worship.
Wow.
And they also decided that they were going to demand that the Wampanoag tribe would return all of the muskets they had acquired over the years. Which was basically like, let's say we spend 50 years buying land from each other, okay? And you've sold a lot of land to me and I've paid you money for it. And now I say, Alma, give me back all the money I paid you. It was the same thing, okay? So after that, there was like this whole 2-year period where the Wampanoag and their allies tried to resist the theft of their lands.
I see.
And so that was kind of one of the starts of the war, because both sides killed as many as they could, and the Wampanoag ended up defeated, and that's when the resistance ended. Their population and the lands were really reduced through that, because it killed off a lot of the Wampanoag. But there are still some communities today in Massachusetts, and there's a couple of specific ones too.
Okay.
So that's kind of cool. Also, one thing that I read was that their culture of passing down stories, and which I always think cultures that pass down stories are so cool. I love it. And so that's how we know some of these things too.
Yeah, like passing down that oral history and hearing, Grandpa tells his grandson a story. Yeah, that's very cool.
So some other stories, and like this, these are more well-known facts about natives. I don't know. But some things to know if you didn't already know this. Pocahontas. Pocahontas was not her real name. I don't even know how to pronounce her real name, but that was not her real name.
Wow.
And she had actually been married and had a child. And then her husband died.
Oh.
And she was pretty young when that happened. And then she was actually kidnapped when she was around 17. And she was forced to marry John Rolfe and forcibly taken to England.
Oh my goodness.
And where they paraded her as a Indian princess is what they called her. They actually renamed her from Pocahontas to Rebecca.
Oh my goodness.
And she died not long after that. She did not handle all that well.
I can't blame her. That is so sad.
And also, I thought about, like, something that, the stories wouldn't talk about is, like, she had a child. And not only was she taken from her country, her land, her family, her home, all of those things, her child, too. Yeah. And she was ripped from everything. And I can't imagine what that would be like.
That is just unbelievably and unnecessarily brutal.
Yeah. And then also, we hear the story of Sacagawea and how she, led Lewis and Clark on this great expedition with the baby on her back. Sacagawea was a Shoshone teenager, and she was not a woman. A lot of people portray her as a woman. She really wasn't. So she had been kidnapped by a different band of natives when she was around 10 years old, and they took her to their village where she was eventually purchased by a French-Canadian fur trader who was her, quote, husband.
Oh my goodness.
And it was him who agreed. He also went along on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And technically it was him and Sacagawea who were leading them. Even though we all know she probably did all the work.
That is very interesting because you never hear that included in the story.
Yeah. And Sacagawea is, I know she's like there's a whole nother story there. And I could spend ages going into that. But I thought it would actually be kind of fun to talk about some common myths.
Yeah, I would like that.
So, one stereotype is that all Native people lived in teepees. But the reality is that, like, yeah, some of them did live in teepees, but others had things like longhouses or earth lodges, hogans, and a hogan is like a round, kind of like a yurt.
Okay.
But it's a little different. And, like, there was just, like, they had lots of different kinds of shelters and houses, things that they did. But it all depended on the tribe.
Which makes sense because of location.
Exactly. When you hear about the tribes that used teepees, a lot of those were the ones that were nomadical tribes.
That makes sense.
Because not all tribes were.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly the tribes that were the tribes that lived in the plains or the mountains. The plains, it was because they had to move with the buffalo. Mm-hmm. They had to move with the food. And the mountains, they had to move based on weather.
Yeah.
So when it was nice, they, like in the summertime, they would come down out of the mountains because so did the animals.
That makes sense.
And then in the winter, when the animals would go back up in the mountains, they would go back up in the mountains too. Again, they were following the food.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, those that lived in, say, the wooded areas, you know, more often had a more permanent type of house, like a longhouse.
Yeah.
But yeah, there were so many different types of houses. But again, like, we only think of teepees. We also think of, like, all natives having horses. And there were some tribes that didn't because they walked. That was just a different thing. And I know I touched a little bit on the stereotype of, like, that Native people didn't really know much or they weren't very smart. But they actually were and still are, like, they're very complex. They actually, okay, here's a fun fact. The first Confederacy actually came from the Iroquois.
Okay.
Our Constitution was actually modeled after theirs.
Wow.
That's a whole nother subject, really, is that the Constitution, everything is worded for white landowning men. It goes so far as to call natives 3/5 of a person.
Wow.
The Constitution explicitly excludes Indigenous people. And it says that other people, like black slaves or black people, were counted as 3/5 human. So we still have a constitution in this day and age that completely excludes natives who were here first, and also completely to be called, I can't imagine being completely discounted or being called 3/5 of a person.
Yeah.
That is, if you want to learn more about the Doctrine of Discovery, which is one of our founding documents, or some of those other documents, and just the history behind them, a really good book is Unsettling Truths by Mark Charles and Soong-Chan Rah. I'll actually we'll put this in our highlights.
Yeah.
Because this is a really good book. It talks a lot about history and how the church in the 15th century gave Christian explorers the right to seize lands from other people who were deemed to be not Christian.
Wow.
In the name of God.
Oh my goodness.
So that's
kind of like, that reminds me of the Manifest Destiny.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly why, too, they would try to make them change their names from their native names to being, you know, Mary and Mark and David, and they tried to make them have Christian Bible names. And wow. I think one thing that I think is interesting that I discovered in my researching, I always kind of had this perception, I realized, that, the natives would talk about their sun god and the rain god and how they asked the rain god for rain.
Mm-hmm.
And I always kind of had this thing in my, this idea that as they were dancing around a fire, because that's often what's portrayed, right? They're dancing around a fire asking the rain god for rain. I always had this idea that they had, this image in their mind that they were doing this to.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like a 3-headed monster kind of looking thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's kind of the image that goes along. But, in my research, I discovered this beautiful quote from someone who said, I'm a Christian, and I pray to the rain god because he is the god of rain. And he is God. He is the one God. And he said, I don't believe that they're any different.
Yeah.
He said, I believe that that the tribes just called them by different names, but it was really one.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was so interesting because it kind of challenges our perception on that too.
Yeah. Well, everything you're saying kind of makes me think of how it's really sad that this beautiful culture that the Native Americans had, these beautiful traditions, the settlers and the Europeans who came over to this land, they didn't want to learn more about this beautiful culture. Instead, they were focused completely on forcing their culture upon these people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that it blows my mind to think about how much further our culture could be along if we had listened. Because when you think about some of their practices that they had, every morning I thank the sun god for the sun. What is that? That is practicing gratitude and gratefulness. That is stopping and saying, God, thank you for the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes it's because it's in different terms.
Yeah.
It really just messes with our brains and it challenges this, box that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, oh, this does not belong in here.
Well, and also I feel like back then, and even still today, among churches even, sometimes there's this belief that if there's something different, you can be led astray.
Yeah.
But that is just simply not the case. And learning about different cultures and their practices won't lead you astray.
Yeah.
Quotation marks to astray.
And I think also there were tribes who were very angry and they didn't pray to the sun god or the rain god. They prayed to the god of war. But then again, I think we can find instances in the Bible where people would have prayed to a god of war.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that just goes to show that there are different people in every culture of the world.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was trying to say.
Yeah. Across Europe, across Asia, every person is different, therefore every group of people is different.
Right. And I think so often when something is just labeled differently, we have a really hard time wrapping our minds around it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm not right on that. Maybe they didn't really, see it as one God the way we do and it was completely different. I don't know. But to me, that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me too.
Another thing that's really interesting is across the world, no matter where you go, in almost every culture, you can find the story of a great flood. Mm-hmm. And there's a native story for I think it's a Mohican tribe, and their story is that there was a flood, and there was the great turtle who came, and he put 2 of every animal on his back. And he was this huge turtle who had this massive back, and he put 2 of every animal on his back. And when the rains were over and the flood was over, he swam them to dry land again. Is it different than a boat? Yes. But it's still 2 of every animal.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's still a big flood. And so it's like, could an ark look like a turtle? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so it's just interesting to think about how the perception of the storyteller is really what we hear.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about the Iroquois Confederacy, they had this great law of peace and a grand council, and they had this whole government system. And the European Americans were so impressed by their democracy. It was a democracy between the 5 different Iroquois nations.
Okay.
They had some discord, and they say that a great man from the Huron nation came to them with a message of peace, friendship, and unity. And at first, the story goes that people didn't want to listen to him because he spoke a strange tongue and his ideas were foreign. But the more that he was there, teaching them how to settle differences without anger and hatred, he proposed that the 5 nations would form a confederacy. They say this was around the year of 900.
Okay. So,
way beyond, way earlier than any other confederacy or democracy.
Wow.
This leader is actually so revered that they refuse to speak his name out loud.
Wow.
And they just call him the Great Peacemaker.
Wow.
So I thought that was interesting. So they first wrote down these laws that they lived under in English in the 19th century. And what they wrote out was a constitution that spelled out their rules for governing, which sounds much like what we have, right? Each nation was independent and governed its own internal affairs. That is where our founding fathers got the idea for states.
Okay.
They established a grand council that had members that would represent all of the member nations. So there we have our House of Representatives.
Wow.
And that was to deal with all the problems that would happen in there. They called them the caretakers of the peace, or in the Iroquois language, they called them the Hoyanana. So one thing that I thought was interesting is that while men made up the Grand Council, they also had women elders who were called the clan mothers, who actually helped choose the Grand Council.
So you're telling me that not only did they have a confederacy, but they had a more evolved confederacy.
100%. They were ahead of the time. They were like, some of these women are knowing where it's at. And these women would look for a guy, basically, to be on the Grand Council. The qualifications were that you had to be kind and honest and noble, and they were looking for integrity, really. But also, here's one of the parts I like. I think this is really interesting. The women also had the power to remove someone from the Grand Council if they needed to.
Wow.
So they could put them on there or also take them off if they violated what was called the Great Law. They also, when they would vote on things, they had to have a unanimous decision.
Wow.
So nobody would feel left out. And I think this is probably partially where our stereotype of everyone sitting around smoking peace pipes. Often in movies, there's, a scene where all of the elders are gathered around the fire, and they're passing around the peace pipe, and they're all smoking it until everyone agrees. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably, maybe this is where some of that stereotype goes with, because from what my research shows, yeah, there were tribes who had a peace pipe, but there were other tribes who did other things. Sometimes it was, here is a blanket for you. Or, here is a meal for you. Take this meal home to your family on our behalf.
Okay.
As a gesture of peace. So it's really cool. Every person had a right to express themselves, and it was just it was so cool. And sometimes, to reach the unanimous decision, it took days.
Yeah.
But they were, dedicated to sticking to it and, making that work. So, the European Americans were really impressed by the democracy. One thing that I read that I thought was interesting was that Benjamin Franklin, who was one of the authors of the Constitution, he was one of the most vocal about that.
Okay.
So, it was actually Benjamin Franklin who proposed the Colonial Grand Council. He really challenged the colonists to create a government similar to the Iroquois Confederacy.
Wow.
So I think that's something else that's funny, because not only are we taught that they were ruthless savages who cared for no one and had very little good to offer, we're taught that they taught us to plant corn and beans and squash together.
Mm-hmm.
What else do our stories say they taught us?
That's a good point.
That's like the only thing our stories say they taught us. And here we have this whole government that
no one knows came from.
Yeah, it's not. It should be. It should be widely known. It should be like, oh, this came from. Like, this was built upon the ideas of the Iroquois Confederacy.
I mean, in maybe even better, we should have become part of the Iroquois Confederacy instead of establishing our own separate government. You know, I mean, who knows what our country would look like today?
I know. Something I like to think about. It's just kind of fun to. Okay, I say fun, but don't get me wrong, if you dwell on it too long, it might be depressing.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, it's kind of fun to, for a short time, think about, like, what, that would have been like. I don't know why. Maybe it's a stereotype. I don't know. Full disclosure. Could be a stereotype. But when I think about, like, oh, what would it be like now? I envision a lot less trees being cut down.
Yeah.
I envision so much less damage to our areas.
Well, and sustainability in general, I feel like.
Yes.
Because they cared about the land, they cared about each other, they cared about animals.
Yeah.
And we're not trying to say that their culture was perfect. We're not trying to say that, or that we don't want to romanticize their culture.
Mm-hmm.
But there were so many beautiful things in their culture that we are not taught to see.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just like, I just want people to be able to see those beautiful things.
Yes.
Also, like, something else that's a stereotype is, what are they always planting? Like, in movies and stuff? Or what are they harvesting?
Corn.
It's always corn. Mm-hmm. And really, like, they also had tomatoes and potatoes and zucchini and, they had a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And, they ate a lot of different, like, animal meats as well, but those are just, like, some of the thousands. Like, also, like, there are so many things that are, like, ingredients, like, there's a lot of, like, different, like, remedies that we have, or, like, natural shampoos, things like that, where the ingredients are things that natives used.
That makes sense.
Because they knew what everything worked for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also something that we lost.
Yeah.
And they're still trying to regain. And also, I think another thing that we think is that native people... Well, okay, there's actually a couple of different stereotypes in this one. One stereotype is that native people only live on reservations.
Okay.
Another stereotype is that native people don't live on reservations anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And another one might be native people only live in certain states. They actually are in every state.
Mm-hmm.
There's been, like, lands that have been given back to them. That is sometimes kind of cool. Man, there's just so many more stereotypes I could talk about, like, in regards to reservations. But
well, maybe we could put up, like, a question sometime and see if people want to hear more about this.
Mm-hmm.
We could probably do several more episodes about this history. But it is also something that if people put time and effort in,
mm-hmm.
they can learn a lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really make sense to me that we're not taught all of this in school, in our history classes. But it's awesome that there are resources available out there somewhere for us to learn more about the true history.
I will say, very sadly, they are hard to find.
Yeah.
I would like to say one thing, though, something that I think that everyone should be aware of, that a lot of us are not. do some research on Mount Rushmore, y'all.
Oh, yeah.
Mount Rushmore is actually stolen land.
Mm-hmm.
It was part of a treaty that, it was, actually that specific mountain was a mountain that they called Seven Grandfathers, and it was a sacred mountain to the Lakota people. When they were looking for a place to put Mount Rushmore, they decided that that mountain was the best one for some reason, and it's part of land that was stolen from them. In the 80s, the tribe actually won a court case where a judge said, "You're right, this land was stolen from you. So here's a bunch of money." And the tribe said, "We don't want the money. We want our land back." Mm-hmm. That money actually still sits in a bank account today. The tribe has never accepted that money because their reasoning is if they accept the money, it's like a completion of a transaction or sale. And they don't want a sale, they want the land.
Wow.
And it's a ton of money at this point, but they don't want it.
Wow.
And they just want their land back.
Mm-hmm.
They won that case. I think it was in the 80s. It could have also been the late 70s. Do you know what year they completed Mount Rushmore?
No.
1991. So even after the judge said, yeah, that land is stolen, they still kept right on.
Wow.
And they just want their land back.
That's crazy.
If you want to know more about that, you can look up #landback. That would probably get you started on a good search. I've always wondered, like, what do we do about situations like this to make them right? Mm-hmm. I've got a little bit of activist in me, and I'm always like, man, how could we fix this? Mm-hmm. But one great idea that somebody had that I saw was, you know how you have, like, the Holocaust Museum? Mm-hmm. What if Mount Rushmore was turned over to the Native people for them to run it think like a museum of Indigenous people, like of their culture and their history, and like you could still go see Mount Rushmore because obviously like the faces have been blasted into rock, they're not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. But also like what if we could like have a museum where people could learn about the Trail of Tears or like actual true Indigenous history?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be really cool.
There's nothing like that. I think that sounds amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I completely agree. That would be very, very cool.
Speaking of mountains.
Yes.
How do mountains see?
I don't know.
They peak.
Peak. That's so funny. They peak.
Well, they do.
Mm-hmm. They do.
They really do.
That was a fun joke to kind of end this episode after learning some uncomfortable truths about the history of America.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun learning even more things than I already knew. I feel like there's always something new to learn.
Yeah.
You can never know all the history. And so kind of in our theme of speaking about uncomfortable topics, about topics that we don't often hear about, we wanted to just kind of open the conversation. We know we did not cover nearly everything, like we're not even close at all. But I think it's so interesting to at least just uncover this topic and start talking about it more. And if we can encourage you to do more research, I think it's really important to know our proper history, to know true history. And it's true history. It extends way beyond the Native history as well. Mm-hmm. So often, like Krystal said, history is told by the victor. And so there is so much more true history out there about other people and other lands besides the Native Indigenous people of America.
And if you want to look into like learning more about Native tribes and you want to learn about the specific tribe that lived in your area, there's actually a website that you can go to that tells you what tribe's territory where you live was in.
That's really cool.
It is so cool. So that's really something that's a really cool resource. Our whole point of talking about all of this right before Thanksgiving here is kind of a new Thanksgiving challenge. Like when you are sitting around the table at Thanksgiving, so often we talk about how, oh, the Pilgrims, they came over and they were so brave. But like also, there were a lot of natives who sacrificed and lost so that we could have all these things we have today.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
There's not a lot of thankfulness shown for that.
Yeah.
Or even understanding of, maybe what they went through.
Yeah. I think that's fair to say. I think that whether we mean to or not, a lot of people don't realize the full history.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't know what the Native people went through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Because, I didn't know all this stuff until I started researching it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we hope you guys enjoyed this and you enjoyed hearing about it as much as we did, learning about it as much as we did.
Mm-hmm.
And we hope you had fun following along.
Yeah. And if you don't already follow us on Instagram or Facebook, you can find us at The Friendship Bread. And if you like this episode, share it with your friends. Let us know. That would help us out a lot if you could just give us a shout out. And then you can also leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That also really helps us get this podcast in front of more people. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. We hope you'll be back next week for another episode of the Friendship Bread podcast.